Welcome, fans, to a special edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling, and I have today a very special guest, a man that I've wanted to speak to about the book that he has recently published entitled, and I'll have to look at my notes so I don't mess it up. There we go with the screen. Killers, Butchers, Crybabies, and Canadian Destroyers, Pro Wrestling in Windsor, Ontario.
Yes.
And I would be speaking about none other than Mr. Jamie Greer. Jamie, thank you so much for agreeing to the interview.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Always love to talk about the history.
Absolutely. And your book is, to say it's a tome is probably a correct characterization. You've got 600 pages in there. Yes. And I want to get into the minutia of how you reached the end product. But before we get into that, can you talk about what the inspiration was for you to write the book?
Absolutely. So I live in Windsor, Ontario, and I'm not originally from Windsor. I grew up in the Niagara Falls area, and I came here for university in about 92, 93, and I've lived here since. And I'm a history buff for just about anything, not just wrestling. And so I'm always fascinated with the history of cities, and especially the ones I'm living in. For years, I was a music journalist actually in town. I was a musician myself, and I covered the local music history and absorbed all that. And about 7-8 years ago, I kind of decided I'd kind of gone as far as I could, or with what I wanted to do anyway, with the music side of it. So I decided to switch to one of my ultimate passions in life, and that was pro wrestling, which I've been a fan of since I was a kid. And I've always been fascinated with the history of pro wrestling, going back to the early days, and I'm talking the 1800s, late 1800s. So I started writing for Last Word on Sports, which is a Canadian online sports magazine, and I was writing for the wrestling department there, and then I soon became the managing editor. And so I was doing all sorts of articles, and then I started writing. I wrote my first piece for Pro Wrestling Illustrated about 3 years ago. And I was sort of firing on all cylinders there, and decided, you know what, I think I'll do a history piece on Windsor. And I knew we had two WWE Hall of Famers. We've got Killer Kowalski and Abdul the Butcher. And I knew Scott D'Amore, obviously with TNA Wrestling, and George Crybaby Cannon. And the Sheik filming big time wrestling here. I knew some peripheral stuff, so I thought I had a good basis for an article. And then so I started researching in the article, and that's when I discovered more things. About Sandy Parker, about Art Nielsen, about Stan Holick, about more and more guys, and more things. And I thought, well, this might turn into a series of articles. And I realized pretty quickly that I couldn't even approve myself when I was the managing editor that, nobody's going to want to read a 6-part series on Windsor's wrestling history per se on a website. So I decided then to start digging into this book, and it became a 2.5-year labor of love. And now we're here 2 months out and the book's out. So it's been a long journey, but I'm thrilled with how it turned out, and thrilled with the response it's gotten.
Yeah, and it's definitely been positive. I know you've had a lot of attention from the wrestling community, which before we get into all of the rich history of the Windsor area, I wanted to get your thoughts on, given the fact that we've had a lot of historical works done about territories, including Canadian territories, but Windsor was always one of those that, if you look at Vance Nevada's book, he talks about the companies that, operated there, et cetera, but never so much of a deep dive into Windsor, which as we'll see is kind of a head scratcher. Do you have any thoughts on why you're basically writing the benchmark work?
Well, Windsor's wrestling history is probably very much like how Windsor itself is seen in Ontario, and forgotten about in most of Canada, I would imagine. Windsor is, for those who don't know, we're 4 hours southwest of Toronto, and we're right across the Detroit River from Detroit, Michigan. So we're about an hour and a half to London from London. So we're kind of the last bastion. We're like the last stop before the United States when you're going down to southwestern Ontario. But we're so much expansive open land between us and London, and then from London to Toronto, that we kind of get forgotten about. And with our close proximity to Detroit, we've always almost been a suburb of Detroit more than anything else. I mean, famously, the Journey song, "Born and Raised in South Detroit," Windsor's known as South Detroit. So, but in a lot of ways, we're too Canadian to be an American city, and we're too American to be a Canadian city. We kind of get left out of a lot of talks. And a lot of historians, when they see Windsor, Ontario, and see that Toronto was our closest Canadian city, or territorial market anyway, they've just always assumed and lumped us in with Toronto. And the truth of the matter was that apart from 2-3 month stints from Frank Tunny in the 40s, we've almost 100% been exclusively tied to the Detroit territory. So it's a tough one to crack. You know, a lot of people just assume that, well, we've covered the Toronto territory, so we don't need to look into Windsor. And people who do the Detroit history never think to look across the river too much. Although Brian Solomon did comment on Windsor quite a bit in his Chic book, but for the most part, Windsor's, like I said, is just kind of forgotten and by the wayside. But in actuality, it had a pretty rich history, and one that tied into a lot of big events.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Which we'll touch on a few. The most I would say daunting aspect of a work of this nature would be, you know, given the large time frame and scope of your book, is that research process. Can you talk about just what that entailed? Because it's got to be more than just a Google search, to say the least.
Absolutely. I mean, the first year and a half was, I would say, 95% research and 5% writing, and that writing was probably a lot more note taking than actual writing down thoughts or narratives. I signed up for a newspaper archive service, and I spent a good part of the first year reading 100 years worth of sports pages. And that may seem unusual in today's market, considering that wrestling is very rarely touched upon in the newspapers. But from the earliest days, and I'm talking the late 1800s up until the early 1960s, the sports departments for most newspapers treated pro wrestling as if it was legitimate, on the level, and on par with, and if not ahead of, you know, the NFL. It was definitely ahead of. I mean, the only thing in Canada I think that probably got more attention than wrestling was the NHL. So, you know, the day after every single show, there'd be a full write up of what happened. You know, who fought who, what happened during every fall, the moves that were used, any cheap tactics that were used, how the audience responded. It was very much like how you would, you know, when you're reading. If you go to some of these websites, you can read recaps of the Raw the night before, or the Dynamite the night before. It was very much like reading that. And here in Windsor, from 1929 until about 1959, so for 30 years, we had weekly wrestling. So that was every single, you know, every Friday, I would just check the Friday section of every paper, and there was the full. So it really became a great way to immerse yourself in what they were going through as fans, you know, what they were experiencing, the shows they were experiencing. You could really get a sense of the people they were gravitating towards. It gave you an idea of, you know, I had the rosters all written out of who all the wrestlers that were used by each promoter during their stretches, and you could see, you know, I tabulated their win-loss records and the how many matches everyone had, so you got an idea of, okay, these were his top 5 baby faces, these were his top 5 heels, and it was just fascinating. And I'm ADHD, so it scratched a lot of itches, because I was constantly going down, and every wormhole would open up something else, because I would see a name and think, like, I've never heard that name before, and then, you know, You go to some of these other archives and discover that this guy became this guy who was a more well-known guy, or this guy became this guy. And it helped solve a lot of issues and track a lot of names that history had stopped at a certain point, and I managed to add a few more years to their historical archives. So it was an amazing journey, and once I finished the book, it was definitely the research that I missed the most, which is probably why I almost immediately jumped into my next book, just so I could get back into the research.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about your current ongoing project. But was it interesting to see how newspapers up until, and correct me if I'm wrong with the time frame, but up until about the early 60s were, for lack of a better term, kayfabe in terms of how they were reporting things, and then about 1960-ish or so, it changed and it got less attention. I think we're about the same age, so those of us of a certain vintage can remember Norm DaCosta's article. In it was the Sun or the Star, one of the two, and how that was treated kind of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and a bit of a joke. But around that dividing point, there was a difference when it stopped being covered as much, and the tone was different. So in a way, the business has been exposed for a long time. Why do you think that happened?
I think one thing I discovered was that it's been exposed for over 100 years. I mean, there was a lot, like when I was saying that most sports departments treated it like it was on the level, there were a lot that didn't. And even the ones that did, there were moments where a lot of times the sports editors seemed like they were in on the joke, so to speak. And they would once in a while do a nod or a wink, or and there was several times where there were some news editors that just flat out called it out, and would poke the bear with promoters and suggest to them that they knew it was fixed. I mean, it was. I think in the 60s, though, I think it was the rise of the gimmicks. I mean, there definitely had been some gimmicks to a degree before. Like there was the English lords, which actually one of the earliest ones is in the book. Lord Lansdowne was a guy from Ohio, but he was an English lord with the monocle and the cape, and came out to God Save the King, which of course rattled the cages of all the Americans that didn't want to hear the British national anthem. And then there was Gorgeous George, of course, who was probably one of the ultimate gimmicks and one of the biggest drawing gimmicks of all time. But there was a certain reality still in that they could be those kind of people. But I think when you started to see things like Zuma the Man from Mars and to a degree the Sheik, although he was still somewhat of a believable, but seeing guys like that, and then the Batman getting his own wrestler and things of that nature, I think that people started to go, wait a second, there's no way this guy would really be wrestling like this or what have you. But I definitely think the rise of the gimmicks probably didn't help. And I think that's probably why you started to see the sports department start to say, all right, we can't hold up this gag for much longer. But there was lots of articles. One of the guys that was an early star in Windsor for a few years, he lived here a few years, and it seemed like he was dodging some heat, because I found an article that he went to the newspaper because he was withheld money because he wouldn't roll over for a guy. So he kind of exposed the business a bit there, and it looked like he kind of got run out of Chicago because of it. So there was definitely little breadcrumb trails placed within the newspapers without necessarily saying it in the wrestling articles themselves, but there was comments and article and made all the time that it was not quite. I mean, that's why almost every ad you'll see before the 1970s will say an exhibition of science and strength. You know, they would say it was an exhibition because they knew if they legitimately said it was a real wrestling contest, then the athletic commissions would have to look in a little quicker. And they didn't want that happening, because then they would lose out on all their money. So they were very careful to keep that crafted. But there was definitely a lot of nods and winks from a lot of the sports writers. And I'm sure a lot of them were given free tickets and wined and dined by some of these promoters, so to keep it a little more on the down low. But it was a fun read because it was written very much into like all of these Jimmy Cagney movies. You can almost see the sports writers writing like this. The grunt and the column, the grunt and groaners, and the pachyderms, and yeah, it was fun. But yeah, I would say it was probably the rise of the gimmicks that probably was kind of the final straw for the sports departments. Anyway,
that makes sense. You had one of the last interviews with Paul Butcher Vachon for the book, and I wanted to ask you about that. Plus, any of the interviews that you did that stand out in your recollection?
Well, Paul was great, and the fun we had was because him and his brother both started in Detroit. I mean, well, I shouldn't say that. They both started in Montreal, their hometown, but they were both quickly sent to train in Detroit. Maurice came about 3-4 years before Paul did. And then Paul's the one that recommended he come back down. That Paul follow the same path as himself and come down and train with Bert Ruby. And Paul was ecstatic, and it was funny because there'd be a lot of silences after I would mention names of some of his opponents, and when I'm talking about it, because he said that nobody ever talked to him about his Detroit days and all the interviews he's ever given. I mean, partially because he wasn't Paul Vachon then. He was a Russian character named Nikolai Zolotov. And but he was flabbergasted. And some of the names I was talking about, the original Dino Bravo and other names and stuff we were talking about. And he'd be like, I haven't thought of that name in 50 years. And so it was great. You could hear the smile, even though he was having great difficulty speaking. But it was a fun interview, and he actually brought up the fact that he thought that Bert Ruby was one of the spearheads, one of the pioneers of the Cold War villains in pro wrestling, because up until then it has still been a lot of Japanese and German villains, sort of the post World War II hangover, so to speak. There were some Russians, but they weren't necessarily portrayed as as communist threats. They were just, Russian bullies. And Bert Ruby, who was a great deal in the book, he was a wrestler and trainer in the Detroit area. He was a Hungarian immigrant, and he had come over to Canada first and then to the U.S., to immigrate to the U.S. But he left because the communists were coming into Hungary. And in the 1950s, there was another big communist revolution, and it was kind of one of the big impetus for a lot of the Cold War stuff, was seeing the communists trying to spread out further across Europe. So Bert really wanted to push this Russian character as a communist threat, and Paul was quite proud of the fact that he was one of his first proteges to do this Russian, and he had longer hair, and he said that it was Bert Ruby that made him grow his beard out and shave his head because he didn't want to look like a lumberjack. He didn't want him to look like this. He wanted to look like a Russian soldier, and this was his view of one of these Russian soldiers, these militaries. I guess in a way it was almost like Lenin's kind of look, and so it was great having him talk about some days and really getting to, because that would have been a part of his life that would have been lost forever if we hadn't had the chance to talk about that. And it was great because I hadn't really realized that he was there as well until going into this research and discovering that Zolotov was him. So it was great to talk about that. And Maurice, of course, when he came a couple of years prior to that, he started off as a masked wrestler. Probably because while he was training and getting his ring time, they didn't really want to expose it, because he would have been known in Canada as an Olympic wrestler because he had gone to the Olympics a few years prior. So just in case he stunk, I guess they wouldn't want to soil the reputation of an Olympian. But so they had him as a mask, and then once he kind of got the hang of things, he unmasked here in Windsor against the Sheik. It was actually the Sheik that pulled his mask off. So that was pretty cool. And then once they both only lasted about a year here, and both of them chose to live in Detroit. They said even though they were offered room and board and stuff over in Windsor, they offered to put them up at a fancy swag hotel in downtown Detroit. So they both took the hotel. So, but they were both. But it was a great interview, and he was such a sweetheart, and he was in good spirits considering his health was in serious question at that time.
Yeah, that's important work for sure. You mentioned Bert Ruby a couple times. And that was actually my next question about his. Who was for fans who haven't heard the name? Who was Bert Ruby, and what was his seminal relationship with Windsor wrestling?
Well, Bert Ruby was, as I mentioned, he was a Hungarian immigrant who escaped or left Hungary in about 1929, 1930, I believe. And then he made his way to Toronto, Ontario first, and he was living there for a little bit. He had done amateur wrestling in the Hungarian army, and so he was quite skilled with amateur athletics and amateur wrestling, and he wanted to go to the Olympics for Hungary initially, but then when he fled, he couldn't, obviously. But he kind of picked up an odd job doing an exhibition, not a wrestling, well, a little bit of performance, but it was mostly posing. He was also quite fit for a gas station opening in Toronto. And as he was doing that, one of the wrestling promoters saw him and said, "Hey, do you want to come work for me?" It was a promoter named Ivan Mikolev, who was kind of the wrestling czar of Toronto in 1929, before Jack Corcoran started the Queensbury Athletic Club a year later, which became Maple Leaf Wrestling. And then he sent Ruby down to Windsor to learn in Detroit, and he ended up staying in Detroit and not going back. But he was a huge star, wrestling star here in Detroit and Windsor for the 1930s. And then when Harry Light took over from Adam Weissmuller as the Detroit promoter in the early 40s there, he made Bert Ruby his head trainer and sort of head talent scout. So Bert Ruby spent a lot of time on both sides of the border going to gyms, and the YMCA here in downtown Windsor was one of his frequent stops, and that's where he discovered Killer Kowalski. He discovered Stan Holick, who became Stan Lazowski and later Stan Nielsen. It's possible it's where he discovered Art Nielsen. I didn't find any conclusive proof of that, but it seemed to be where he found a lot of his Windsor side people. But he trained a great deal of people. He trained the Sheik. He trained Leaping Larry Shane. All the way up to George the Animal Steele. He was a huge, influential trainer, but I don't think gets nearly enough credit as being one of the guys who trained so many guys during that period. Brute Bernard was another one that he trained. Mighty Igor. It's a monstrous list of talents from the 1940s. To the 1960s, and then of course one of his star pupils was Lou Klein, who became his assistant trainer, and then Lou Klein, of course, went off to become a trainer himself, and then Killer Kowalski went off to become a trainer himself. So you start doing these generational gaps, you start to see the influence of Bert Ruby's training going through ever. So unfortunately, when there was a great territorial war for Detroit in the late 1950s that was won by Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle, who had come in from Indiana, Chicago, and they had this outlaw promotion that they eventually sold to the Sheik in 1964. It became Big Time Wrestling. But one of the things they did was they ostracized a lot of the Harry Light office, and Harry Light was kind of forced into retirement. But for some reason, Lou Klein jumped to Barnett and Doyle and became their head trainer, and they kind of left Bert Ruby out in the cold, and the Sheik went with them, and of course he was one of the proteges of Ruby. So Bert Ruby was kind of left out in the cold there in the 60s, and then unfortunately he passed away in the late 60s there. But he had his own promotion as well called Motor City Wrestling, which was where a lot of guys started. Abdullah started out there as well. He was also trained by Bert Ruby and Gino Brito, who was another one of his assistant trainers. So there were so many guys. Actually, George Cannon was another one that was trained by Bert Ruby. So there's so many. Like, it's just a huge list of guys from this area on both Windsor and Detroit that Bert Ruby was the foundation for, and definitely somebody who deserves a lot more respect and a lot more recognition. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, well, hopefully your book brings that out. Before I ask you about the relationship between Windsor and the Detroit, specifically the big time wrestling territory, Hannibal has a question here. He's asking, when was the last time WWE came to Windsor, and was it even a regular stop for them ever? I seem to remember them having a house show there about 10 to 15 years ago randomly.
Correct. I believe it was 2013 and 2014. They did stop twice, but they have not. Generally because there was no need to. With Detroit right there, Detroit was their stop here. They weren't going to hit somewhere. Like our downtown, you could see the Joe Louis Arena across the river. So it was literally a 5-minute drive from arena to arena. So it wouldn't have made any sense for them to come here. They did add us as a house show stop for 2 years in a row at the WFCU Center, where the Windsor Spitfires play now. But they drew about 3,500 each. So, I mean, they weren't terrible house shows. I mean, that's about what, 2013. There we go. Someone just put it up there. That's right. They came twice, and for whatever reason, they scaled back after that, decided not to do some of the smaller towns. But they were doing London as well, which is midway between Toronto and Detroit. So it was probably an unnecessary expense. We've definitely had double WWE involvement in the past, though, both times that Detroit hosted a WrestleMania. So whenever there's a big event of that nature, like SummerSlam or what have you, there's usually some involvement with Windsor. So we've definitely had some involvement, and it's felt like Windsor was a WrestleMania town, especially the one at Ford Field. WrestleMania 3 wasn't quite so much, but the one at Ford Field, WrestleMania 20, I believe it was
23.
23, that's what it is.
I was there, and I stayed in Windsor.
Did you?
Yeah. So there you go.
I remember John Morrison took the Via Rail down to Windsor and had a big press release from there, and Dolph Ziggler did some appearances over here. I believe CM Punk did some as well. It was, and then Jericho had Fozzy played here that year as well, like that weekend. So they had a big event for it. So we do get stuff, but we only had those 2 house shows. Yeah, not much of a stop, I'm afraid.
Well, as they're scaling back, or dare I say, eliminating house shows, I don't think that's going to change. But back to that relationship between Windsor and Detroit, is it correct? And I think you may, I'm paraphrasing, but in the book you refer to Windsor as sort of being a developmental territory for Detroit. Is that correct? Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So when they came down in 1929, it was Ivan Mikulev, that guy who was the one who started the wrestling in Toronto in 1929 as well. That year he was quite bold, and he started in Toronto. He was doing extremely well. Then he started going to Brantford, and then Hamilton, and then London, and then he came to Windsor in December to launch the first one. He had the guy that was running it for him in Windsor was a wrestler himself, a guy named Jack Milo, who was a light heavyweight grappler who had wrestled all across the U.S. and had gone through Chicago and Minnesota and stuff. So he was friends with Adam Weissmuller, who was the Detroit promoter. So they did a lot of talent sharing, and that's sort of when the relationship began. Almost immediately, almost like about 1930 was when it started, and Weissmuller passed away from health issues in the late 30s, and in the early 40s, his treasurer Harry Light took over, and Harry Light started a relationship with the promoter over here named Blake Robinson, and starting in the 40s, they sort of set up Windsor as Harry Light's developmental territory. So in the sense that, because like I said, he had Bert Ruby as a talent scout and trainer, so all of the younger guys would start off in Windsor for 6 months to a year. And like I mentioned earlier, we had weekly cards here, so it was every week. They would work sort of the circuit of sort of Windsor, Sarnia, Chatham, kind of the little towns around it, and a couple small towns in Michigan. They would just to get their ring time and to kind of get their practice in and get their. So you definitely see this trend of all these guys like the Sheik of when he was still the Sheik of Araby, and Brute Bernard when he was just Big Jim Bernard, and George Cannon when he was George MacArthur, and so you've got all these guys. Even Luke Klein started off as the masked Green Hornet. So you've got all these guys starting off in the various early stages, and a lot of these and the guys like Maurice and Paul Vachon. That was the same thing. They were sent here to learn. So it was a developmental. It wasn't just developmental for Detroit. We also did developmental work for Montreal, and that was largely due because Jack Britton from Montreal had started coming down to work with Harry Light as well. And of course, Jack Britton was ran the midget group out of Windsor, Detroit, because it had such a great central location. We were 4 hours from Chicago, 4 hours to Toronto, right across from Detroit. It's only 8 hours to Montreal or 10 hours to Montreal. So, and then you can go to Boston, you can go to New York City. There's a certain Eastern and Midwest location, so it became very handy there. So Jack Britton was constantly Jack Britton brought down the MacArthurs, brought down the Vachons. He's the one that brought down George Cannon, and eventually he moved his family down, and his son Gino Brito trained and started down here. So that was something that stayed right through till the mid '60s, and Barnett and Doyle kind of halted that whole thing because they didn't need to build stars in this area. They had all their Chicago and Indiana guys, so they brought in Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder and all that, and they were smart and signed two of the top rising stars from Detroit. They brought in Bobo Brazil and the Sheik, and that was the only two guys they needed initially. I mean, they eventually, when Bert Ruby passed away and Motor City Wrestling kind of folded, they did eventually pick up all the other guys like Louis Martinez and Mighty Igor and all these guys. Finally made their way over and brought in the Kangaroos and all that stuff. But the Sheik did still continue a partnership with Windsor by filming Big Time Wrestling over here. So it was filmed right on the riverside at the CKLW TV studio, which is now the building's still there. It's now the CBC building. But so Windsor's had a very symbiotic relationship, and then through the 70s, there was Bearman Dave McKigney that was running the shows here, but he was doing a lot of his shows in Windsor. He'd do in partnership with the Sheik, so that way the Sheik didn't have to run his Big Time Wrestling over here. It would go with Canadian Big Time Wrestling, which was Big Bear Promotions. In the 90s, and then actually in the 80s, you had Dick the Bruiser's Bruiser Bedlam program was running in Windsor with Cannon helping him out. And from the 90s till now, Border City Wrestling has been really tight with a lot of the independent promotions over there. So Windsor's been a very, very symbiotic relationship with Detroit, and their history is very, very intertwined. And I've joked, and I'm sure anyone that's caught any of my other appearances will probably be sick of this analogy, but it's like it's very much like reading it as if you're reading it for Detroit's history. It's like reading Batman's biography written by Robin. Like Windsor was the sidekick the whole way, so we've got a very different perspective on what happened, but you can still get a very good story of Detroit's history as well. So from the 40s till I would say probably about 62, 63, Windsor was very much the developmental system for NWA Detroit.
Yeah, very cool. One of the interesting discussions in your book is around Frank Tunny and his attempt to absorb the Windsor promotion into Maple Leaf Wrestling. What was the impetus for that? And is there a fair comparison between McMahon and Georgia Championship Wrestling, that type of dynamic that never worked?
Yeah. And you know what? And very much So Tunny, obviously, Tunny just wanted as much of Ontario as he could get. He was getting opposition in the north from Larry Kasaboski and his Northland Enterprises, and they had a pretty peaceful relationship for the most part, I believe. So he kind of left Northern Ontario to Kasaboski, but he still wanted the rest of Ontario, and you know he pretty much had everywhere up to London. So he was hoping to add in the entire province, or at least all southwestern Ontario. The problem I found with, or at least my speculation was that he just didn't know the area all that well. Windsor and Detroit, almost from the get-go, their rosters were always, 60 to 75% local wrestlers. There were guys from Michigan, there was guys from Windsor, because it's a very blue-collar working-class city. Both of them were. So, so many of the people in the crowd were factory workers. So, and a lot, like we were talking a bit before we went on air about the great migrations of all the people that moved up to Detroit in the U.S. and then from Canada also moved to Windsor to work in the burgeoning auto factories in the 30s and 40s. So a lot of these wrestlers who also worked in there. So there was a certain camaraderie about seeing this, because, you might see your buddy that works the line wrestling in the ring. So it created this real sense of loyalty that all the promoters that lived here and worked out of here knew that, and they kept the rosters intentionally, and they built stars out of these guys. I mean, there was guys that were huge stars here that weren't necessarily stars anywhere else. But when Tunny came in, he brought in his entire roster from Toronto. And granted, there were some huge stars. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there was Whipper Billy Watson during his prime, or at least during his rise to his prime in the 40s there. Sky Ali, he brought in some huge big names. And his first few shows usually did pretty well. He usually brought in 3,000, which was a pretty big number for the Windsor crowds back then. And but by the third, fourth, fifth card, it would go from 3,000 to 1,500 to 1,200 to 900 to 600. Because the people were like, okay, well, great, I've seen Billy Watson 3 times now, but where's my local guys? Where's Dynamite Johnny Gates? Where's Leaping Larry Shane? Where's this guy? So I don't know whether it was Tunny pulling himself out, or if it was just the fact that the Butcher brothers who owned the Windsor Arena, if they just decided that they wanted to go back to the local guy running the shows. But Tunny just didn't do well here, and didn't have a lasting effect, which very much the same as what happened with McMahon and with the Black Saturday. Didn't read the audience and didn't realize that they wanted the Southern wrestling. They wanted to see the guys from Georgia and the guys from Texas and the guys from whatever and Alabama and so forth. They didn't want to see these guys from New York in the comical way that McMahon was portraying them. So very similar, I think. And he didn't put up much of a fight. It didn't seem like. He occasionally did little dips and duels here. He would send to like the Leamington Fair. He would send a show here and there, but he seemed, and especially once 1948, once the NWA started, and with Tunny joining the NWA in '49 and Harry Light being one of the founders of the NWA, he stopped even trying after that. I mean, he did kind of form an alliance with the Sheik in '69, so he kind of, in a way, got his way into the area by forming his own alliance with Detroit. But yeah, he kind of abandoned Windsor as being a project.
One of the also interesting components of the book, I know a lot of fans are familiar with the fact that Larry Shreve, Abdullah the Butcher, is from Windsor, but you touched on some of the other names such as Killer Kowalski, Crybaby Cannon, the original Sheik, Bobo Brazil, or at least made their bones.
Yeah.
Made their bones in Windsor. Brute Bernard, Dick the Bruiser.
Yeah.
What do you think the environment there was that led to, that's quite an impressive roster, and that's not even, scratching the surface. What was the environment like there that bred such Hall of Famers?
Well, they made I mean, Windsor and Detroit, but a lot. Even if you just look through all the Windsor wrestlers, there's a certain toughness in this area. I mean, Windsor and Detroit share so much in common that it was similar on both sides. That I think it was just the fact that that so many factory workers and so much automation and so forth. They were tough blue collar workers, and they bred tough blue collar kinds of guys. I mean, that's why Dick the Bruiser was such a huge star here in '59 when he came in. Excuse me. But you look at the list of all the guys, like Art Nelson was a barrel chested, real tough guy, and in a lot of ways was the blueprint for what Dick the Bruiser and Reggie Lazowski the Crusher became. And Reggie was a early tag team partner of Art Nelson. I mean, Stan Lazowski, another big muscle guy that was with the Crusher, and then he went on with Art Nelson. You've got so many of these guys, and you look at the history, and it even starts earlier. Bull Curry in the 1930s cut his teeth in Detroit and Windsor as well, and he was doing hardcore stuff in the 1930s. I'm reading reports of riots taking place in the arenas here because he's cut some guy's head open with a chair in 1936. This is so, and so this area is created, like you've got Bull Curry, and then Ivan Kamakov from the Russian Kamakovs. They were equally violent. Excuse me. I've got like Kamakov used in the 1940s was using a coat hanger as a weapon in the ring. He would take the triangle part and he would stretch it open, put it over a guy's head and choke him out. And then if that didn't work, he would take the hooky part and gouge them in the face. So, I mean, Detroit has always bred these kind of hardcore tough guys. And then from then we had a local guy. I was mentioning guys who were big stars in this area, but never not somewhere else. We had a guy here named Dynamite Johnny Gates, who was a local Windsor guy. And I interviewed his daughter, who's now in her 70s. She was an amazing woman. And she was talking about just the reason why he never went anywhere else was he was a devout family guy. He just didn't want to drive. He wouldn't go anywhere longer than 4 hours away because he had to be back that night. So he did a little bit of Chicago TV, but wouldn't go anywhere else. So he just stayed a regional guy. But he was another hardcore specialist, and he was in a tag team with the Sheik early on in the Sheik's career. So I'm almost guaranteed that some of Dynamite Johnny Gates' rough stuff rubbed off from the Sheik, and then you've got the Sheik, and then you've got Abdullah, and then you've got Kowalski, and then you've got, right up to this day, you've got guys like Rhino and Sabu. This area has just bred these rough and tough sort of guys that look like they could roll off of any construction site and plow you with a wrench. And a lot of cases, some of these guys have done that in the. I think it's just always had that mentality. Detroit and Windsor, it lives hard and plays hard, and that's rolled over into their wrestling as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You talk about in the book one of the many interesting parts is the story of Abdullah the Butcher and his. He's still out there today, grifting, having GoFundMe's and trying to chase that dollar. But you did some research which indicated that started very young. Could you tell the fans that story?
Yeah, so he was him and his brothers. He came from a very poor family, and he was out selling newspapers. And he had said that he would cry. He would cry until somebody would come and buy the newspapers. Instead of going door to door, he would wait. He would cry and have people come, and he would cry and say that he had to sell all his papers before he went home, or his dad would go wild on him. And so guys would buy the paper and he would sell them all. And then he said he finally got caught one day when some guy went to his dad and told him, "How could you do this?" And his dad said, "I never said that. Whatever. I never did. I don't do that." But he did that afternoon.
Wow. So I guess it's in his DNA to be a carny, so to speak. Can you talk about some of the classic matches that occurred in the Windsor Arena? And correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the site of the only original Sheik versus Sabu encounter.
Yeah. So that Windsor Arena was kind of our Madison Square Gardens, and that was where all the promoters wanted to work. It was probably the most used venue in the area, and it was first used in 1930 for wrestling, and the last show was George Cannon's last show in 1993. But yeah, 1986, Bearman, who I know someone just put up a comment there about Bearman shows. The Wild Man Dave McKigney, one of his last shows in Windsor was in 1986, and Sabu was known as Terry SR at that point, as in Terry's Sheik's Revenge was what the SR apparently stood for. Superfly Terry SR, because he was a bit of a high flyer, as we know Sabu can be. And I guess it was one of those things where the Sheik was supposed to wrestle somebody else that night, and he no-showed. And they ended up putting him in against his nephew, and that ended up being the only time those two ever actually faced each other, because they had they usually were tag team partners. That's the way she kind of wanted to bring Sabu in. So that was definitely kind of a historical note there. But there was a lot of NWA World Title Championship matches happened there. Billy Watson defended his at once or twice there. Lou Thez actually had 2 title defenses there. Jim Londos, probably the biggest show we ever had was 12,000 people packed into an arena into Windsor Arena in 1931 to see Jim Londos defend his title. It was Jim Londos' debut in Windsor. And for historians know exactly the magnitude of what Jim Londos was. But Jim Londos was a world champion in the 1920s and 30s who was probably pound for pound. It might be the greatest draw in the history of the sport. I mean, I know guys have definitely drawn more nowadays, but that's only because arenas are bigger now. But if you were to look at the population densities and the arena sizes of the time, Londos was an absolute beast at what he was drawing. I mean, I think he had one back in Greece that drew over 100,000 people is the claim. But he's 12,000 people fit into Windsor Arena, and now that sounds like a lot for a smaller arena for back then, but it was NHL sized at that point. Windsor Arena, when it first opened, was actually home for the Detroit Red Wings for their first year in the NHL because the Olympia was still being built. They were called the Detroit Cougars at that stage still, but they had their first NHL season here, so they had expanded the Windsor Arena to be an NHL-sized level. So I believe which at that time wasn't NHL level today, but it held about 9,800, 9,700. That was for hockey, but they put seats on the ice and so forth, and they crammed in 12,000. And that's back in the days when they sold standing room only tickets, and you can be sure that there was probably a fire code violation that night, because I'm sure even 9,700, that's almost 3,000 more people they crammed in that building. That I'm sure there were some uncomfortable people at the top, but that would have been one. By a time machine, I would love to go back and see just what the atmosphere was like in that, with that many people crammed in there.
You also have touched upon, and it's a portion of your book, Scott D'Amore's Border City Wrestling, which was, a highly successful company and one of those early, to use the term, super indies, if you will. Can you talk about how Border City came to be? And I like your thoughts on the new promotion that's about to debut, Maple Leaf Pro, under D'Amore's, who's got 30 years experience plus. Do you think that has a shot at becoming a truly national promotion? I know we've had, as a country, we really haven't had a national promotion per se. No. Vancouver under Tomko had national TV for a while there, but certainly they didn't tour past the Stampede territory. Do you see the new Maple Leaf Pro as having a shot with that?
I think it's definitely got the best shot we've had in a long time. Yeah, like you said, I mean, we've definitely had TV or promotions that have had national coverage, so to speak. Like you said, All Star Wrestling out in Vancouver did. Stampede you could get across most of Canada. George Canyon Superstars of Wrestling was nationally syndicated, but again, like you said, they were for the most part largely regional in their touring. Cannon came close. I mean, he was running shows from Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, but again, he ignored Eastern or sort of Manitoba and westward. So um, I know it looks like it's going to be starting out based out of Ontario, but he's definitely got the contacts and the ability to do the footwork to get it nationally across as our first true national promotion. I definitely hope so. I mean, considering the impact Canada's had on the wrestling world for over 100 years, I mean, the fact that we've never had our own national promotion is almost silly. But I guess, I mean, in a sense, that's lent itself to how the territorial system worked. I mean, nobody tried to do one because they were all quite happy with their territories. And then by the time anyone thought about uniting to do a national one, Vince McMahon had pretty much bought up Stampede in Toronto and ousted Montreal and taken over. So WWE essentially became our national promotion by extension because it became a North American promotion. It kind of took up all of it. But I hope so. I definitely hope so. I mean, Border City Wrestling is now in its 31st year. He lucked into some great opportunities when he was younger, and managed to learn from some great people. Like when he was 17 years old, he was booking enhancement talent for WWF and WCW, and he was learning under the wheelhouse of Jody Hamilton, the Assassin. And he's mentored. You'll see in the book he's mentored with lots of different people that have had some great, from Terry Taylor to even to King Kong Bundy, to whoever. I mean, there was just people that have all kinds of booking experience at some level or working with certain things. And then, of course, his runs with TNA, for a good chunk of the 2000s, he was a major figure behind the scenes there. And then, of course, the last 7 years, he's got the connections, he's got the respect, he's, throughout the industry that you're seeing a lot of big names jumping on right off the bat. He's got working relationships with AEW, and you see TNA stars on there, and you see New Japan stars on there. So I mean, he's got a lot of people sort of cheering for him and helping behind the scenes. So I hope so. I think so, and I guess we'll find out October 19th and 20th.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked his heel character on early TNA as that.
Team Canada.
Yeah, met him, and he's a nice guy, but kind of a natural heel.
Yeah, yeah.
You have quite a collection of Windsor-centric memorabilia. What would be your most cherished or prized piece, if you will?
That's a good question. I collected a lot of programs, a lot of really cool programs that I've collected from the 1950s. Probably one of the coolest ones is actually Luke Klein's gold medal from 1939. A gentleman got a hold of me. His aunt had been in a relationship with a wrestler back in the old days, and he was nobody in his family was wrestling enthusiast, shall we say. So he didn't want to throw out all of her memorabilia she had from her time with this gentleman. So he asked if I wanted it, and I got it. And it was a lot of pictures and some, personal photos. And, I mean, nothing rude, but, just them on vacation and things like that. But it was Luke Klein who was the gentleman. And one of the things he had given her was his gold medal from 1939, which he won in the Michigan Nationals, the amateur nationals, for him to go to the Olympic squad. Unfortunately, the Olympics he was training for got canceled because of World War II, and so we had to do something to make money, and he turned pro that year instead of going to the Olympics. So that's a pretty cool little piece. I'm trying to think what else I've got. Lots of actually, one of the ones I got it right here. This is a magazine, a 1972 magazine, because one of the things we talk about is Killer Kowalski had a 16-year feud with Bruno Sammartino.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a 1972 magazine that was signed by Bruno and Kowalski.
Wow.
So that's a kind of a cool one. That thing in the back there, I don't know if you can see that. This is a early 1950s. It's a beer ad for Killer Kowalski. Get that bad glare.
Wow, he was put together, wasn't he?
Oh, he was. He
Yeah.
was, it's one. I mean, he's one of those things too that, you know, like Andre the Giant. People tend to only think of them from the last years of their career, and you think, how could that guy have ever been such a big star? And then you forget that, you know, Andre was ripped when he was younger. He was lean and mean. Excuse me. Got a little bit of bad ragweed allergies this time of the year, and
he was a vegan too, correct?
He
Lifelong?
was.
Yeah,
At least he was at least a hardcore vegetarian. I don't know if he was completely off dairy, but I know he was definitely off all meat and things of that. And I don't think he ate eggs either. And he went vegetarian pretty early on. It was in the 50s, I think. I've got it in the book there. I forget the exact date, but he was, because I remember it made a big waves because he was one of the first celebrities to come out as a vegetarian. And because he had read an interview with I believe it was a cyclist that had gone vegetarian and discovered that he didn't lose any of his muscle mass or any of his speed and everything else. So he thought he would try it, and he was a pretty devout vegetarian right at the end of his life, which is crazy because he looks like such a wild beast. You'd think he'd be the kind of guy that would eat you know, like the Rock's schedule, where he eats, you know, a salmon for breakfast and 2 steaks for lunch and a whole chicken for dinner. You think that was Kowalski, but he was a lot of vegetables.
Yeah, that's a really interesting facet of his story.
Yeah, it kind of takes away a bit from the killer.
Yes. In terms of all the research that you did for this particular book, what was the most surprising facet or item that you found out about the history of the business in the area there?
Discovering how so many of the people that were from Windsor. I mean, I digging into to Sandy Parker, who was a great inspiration. It turns out, I mean, she was trained by Lou Klein. She's originally from Vancouver, and she came to Windsor because she had family here, but she had discovered that Lou Klein had a wrestling school in Michigan, and so she came over here, and the big thing with her was that in 1973 she went to Japan, to All Japan Women's Wrestling, which was one of the most ahead of its time wrestling companies in the world in the history. She went there and won the world championship, and that made her the first black woman to win a world championship in wrestling. So that was pretty cool to find out that the first black women's champion was from Windsor. One of the things I was really excited about was to discover that Chief Don Eagle had a 6-month starter run here before he got his launch in Montreal, because I'd always read that he started off in Montreal because he's from the Kahnawake reservation, the Mohawk reservation there near Montreal, and he's largely touted as starting off in the Montreal territory because they claimed him, and Montreal was a far bigger territory back then than even Detroit. But his dad was also a wrestler, Chief Joseph War Eagle, and he was based out of Cleveland, Ohio, and with the Mohawk treaties, they could pass back and forth through the borders. So Don Eagle was pretty much living back and forth between Cleveland and Montreal for Kahnawake, and he was a Gold Glove boxer in Cleveland, and he decided to go for it with wrestling, and he was I'm assuming he was probably sent up here, and for 6 months he was working in Detroit and Windsor, and he had a good 6 month stint here. He was wrestling almost weekly, and became a pretty good star here. And that was the 6 months prior to his Montreal start. So that was pretty exciting to find out that he kind of had his polish, because I'm sure his dad probably taught him a lot as well. And I know he did some work with Bach Estes, who was another Indigenous wrestler. He ended up becoming a promoter in Indiana, and then working for the Funks in Amarillo for a while there. But it looks like he definitely probably got some polish from Bert Ruby and probably Lou Klein in the late 50s there when he came up to make his start. So that was pretty cool. Or sorry, late 40s, sorry, to get his start.
That's that's definitely the type of history that has been lost, so to speak, through the passage of time, and that's great that you're able to capture that. But Jamie, what's next for you? I know what's next. I'm really looking forward to this work, and we definitely want to have you back to talk about it. But can you let the fans know what you're working on right now?
So I'm started preliminary research, which again is reading newspapers and going through all that on the history of Maple Leaf Wrestling. So pretty much going from the start of Jack Corcoran starting the Queensbury Athletic Club in 1930, or at least his wrestling division side, because he had been doing the boxing since the mid-20s. Going from that all the way up until 1984, up until when the WWF kind of bought the Tunnys out. And then a little bit, and then I figure this will probably be, I don't think it's going to take as long as the Windsor book. The Windsor book was 3.5 years and pretty expansive. This one's just focusing on one promotion, so it'll be a little bit more localized. And but it's probably going to be at least another good year or so. And also we'll look at the first year of Maple Leaf Pro, so we can do in the whole wraparound of this promotion, and hopefully we'll have seen Maple Leaf Pro in Toronto by then. I know that one of the things Scott did mention in one of his appearances was that he hopes to get Maple Leaf Pro into Maple Leaf Gardens next year. Although I think it's now the Movati Athletic Center or Complex. It's now they still have an ice rink in there. They've still got the hockey rink in there, and it's now one of the university's rinks, but still, it may not be a 20,000 seat venue in there, but it's still about 3,000. So that's enough to do a decent sized show in there. So hopefully we see Toronto get Maple Leaf back, and it'll be a nice little tie up for the book. So that's the next project, is to look at the Toronto area. Now that I've done Windsor, and now it's time to go ahead and branch out to a little bit bigger now and see what we can pull together on the Tunnys and their incredible story with Maple Leaf Wrestling.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Being born and raised in Northern Ontario, that was it for me, including the big event in '86, and that was my first live show, and that was a big one. So really looking forward to that. Yes, yeah. Great show. But where can the fans get the book, and where can they find you on social media to keep up to date with your progress?
So on Facebook, if you look up Windsor Wrestling on Facebook or Twitter or X, whatever it's called, you'll find my handles on there. And on Facebook, the page is just the history of wrestling in Windsor, Ontario. And you can get the book. You can get the book from Amazon. It's on Amazon in almost every country, and it's just look up Killers and Butchers, and it'll pop up, and it's up on Amazon, free shipping for Prime members, obviously, and good to go.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, Jamie. We'll keep in touch, and I would encourage the fans to definitely check out your book, as it's very unique, and again, as you pointed out in the recent past, we're losing a lot of these folks that have that historical memory, and it's great to see it make it on paper and thus be preserved. But we'll keep in touch, and
absolutely.
Back.
All right, great, thank you.
Well, fans, that's it for this edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the HannibalTV.com. Hit that like button if you like our videos somewhere that still exists, and the notification, and you won't miss any of the great content that we always deliver on the HannibalTV.com, including this interview. But for now, I'm Jack Kilby. Take care.